So welcome everybody. Just waiting for a few more people to sign in to the webinar before we get started today, but thank you for joining us for this webinar session on the Energy Policy Simulator for Canada. Give it a few more moments. All right, well, I think we'll get started just in view of our wanting to make sure that we don't waste anybody's time here. So my name is Bora Plumtree. Thank you, everyone. I'm a policy analyst in the federal program at the Pembina Institute, and I'll be moderating the presentation and our time together over the next hour. Apologies if I sound a bit frog-throated. I'm still recovering from a nasty cold, so please bear with me. And Stephen, could we launch into the next slide? So just a bit of background. Pembina, for those of you who may not know, is a national nonprofit clean energy think tank with offices around Canada, as you can see. And we were founded in the early 80s in the heart of the massive oil fields in Drayton Valley, Alberta. We're one of the first voices and research outfits in Canada to start talking about sustainable development. And that was before the Brundtland Commission issued its landmark report in 1987, for those of you with long memories. Pembina has a long record of technical consulting with industry, as well as participation in policy and regulatory processes in many provinces. Today, we have programs covering the federal, provincial, and municipal levels in several subject areas, including renewable energy, oil and gas, transportation, and energy efficiency in the built environment. So the Energy Policy Simulator is the kind of project we love at Pembina because it's brought staff from different teams and regions together to work on something that we think has national significance. I'm speaking today from our Toronto office. Meanwhile, we've got Bree Reel, an analyst in Vancouver, Benjamin Israel, an analyst in Calgary, joining us today, as well as Jeffrey Rissman, Industry Program Director and Head of Modeling at Energy Innovation in San Francisco, who has worked tirelessly on this project with us and also on the core model coding and construction that serves as its foundation. So I'd also just like to give a couple of quick shout outs as well. First to Sarah Hastings-Simon, Pembina's Clean Economy Director in Calgary, who unfortunately couldn't be with us today, but has been a central force in getting this project off the ground. And finally to Stephen Hoy, our BC Comms lead, also in Vancouver, along with Bree, who's providing technical assistance behind the scenes here and who's been really helpful in setting up this webinar. So thanks, Stephen. We turn to next slide. Thanks. So again, we're really grateful you've given up time from your busy schedule during a busy season. We're glad to have you here because, as you probably all know, it's a really busy time for climate and energy policymakers in Canada. There's lots happening and much that is challenging in this space these days. And one of the things we're trying to do with this project, this simulator, is to help bring greater objectivity to the public sphere and to build civil understanding of the options Canada has, not only for reducing its greenhouse gas emissions, but for doing so in a way that uses a smart, effective, and efficient combination of policies across different sectors of the economy. We're also hoping to help empower government as it continues to engage in interdepartmental dialogue, both vertically and horizontally, around finding solutions to some of the implementation challenges associated with delivering on the Pan-Canadian framework on clean growth and climate change. And I'm pleased to let you all know that over the past few months, we've presented this work to multiple federal departments, including Transport Canada, NRCan, Agriculture and Agri-Foods Canada, and Environment and Climate Change Canada. And we've received very helpful and generally positive feedback. So finally, just before we get into the presentation proper, I just wanted to say additionally, because we know many of you joining us today have already afforded us a measure of your attention with respect to this work on the Energy Policy Simulator. We really do appreciate that and the vote of confidence you've shown us by re-engaging today. And just so the audience is aware, we've got representatives from several different orders of government here online today, as well as folks from industry, academia, and other NGOs. So I'll now just quickly run through the agenda, please, Stephen, and so participants have an idea of what to expect, and I'll mention a few logistical items as well. We're going to turn to an introduction to the project from Bree, and who's going to walk us through as well the Pan-Canadian framework policy scenarios that we've developed as part of this launch. Then we'll move to Ben, who's going to give us a demo of the core capabilities of the tool. And then finally back to me, I'll be moderating a Q&A discussion. I'll do a rundown of the logistics then, but I'll just encourage you to track any questions that come to mind throughout the presentation and submit them through the questions chat box as we go. Hopefully you can see the little sub menu there in WebEx, but if not, you can feel free to enter your questions into the chat function as well, and we'll try to collect them there too. So finally, as with any open source project, I'd like to just say that this model is continually evolving and changing based on the feedback we're receiving. It's quite a new thing for Canada. So if anyone on the line has comments or suggestions as to how we can make the tool more useful for you, again, please let us know in the Q&A or by sending us an email afterwards. And with that, I'll turn to Bree now for an introduction to the project. Bree?
Okay, thanks so much, Bora. So the Energy Policy Simulator is a tool developed by Energy Innovation and was built in a way that it can be applied to different countries and jurisdictions by keeping the underlying structure the same, but changing the data and assumptions that go into it. So far, the tool has been developed for 5 other countries, including the US, China, Mexico, Indonesia, and Poland. And we at the Pembina Institute have now partnered with Energy Innovation to develop a Canadian version, which is the 6th instance of this tool. So the EPS was designed to help policymakers and the public understand the impacts of energy and environmental policies, find the optimal way to meet climate goals, and make unbiased and data-supported decisions. So the ultimate goal of the model is to help figure out which policies will significantly reduce emissions of harmful pollutants and at least cost or maximum economic gain. For Canada, this model is important because it fills a current gap where there's previously been a lack of this type of resource. The way it differs from existing models is that it's free and public, so it can be used by anyone, and it's also open source. So unlike government modeling, it allows for all the input data and assumptions to be fully accessible and understood. By providing this type of free and open source tool, we're hoping to help equip governments and civil society with improved information and an improved ability to engage constructively in discussions of our energy policies. It's important to acknowledge that although this is the only free and open source model of this kind available in Canada right now, oh, sorry, am I cutting out? I'm back. Okay. Okay, sorry about that. So yeah, even though it's the only free and open source model like this in Canada right now, it's part of an ecosystem of models that should, of course, all be considered in making decisions about climate policy. The consideration of this whole ecosystem is important because different models have different strengths and weaknesses. For example, a huge benefit of this model is that it's free and open source, but we have sacrificed some granularity in exchange for transparency, accessibility, and fast runtime. So this EPS isn't meant to provide the definitive answer for what Canada should do on climate policy, but instead it's meant to help answer that question and also to foster discussion. We're hoping that the tool equips civil society with a better understanding of what policy options are available. We're hoping it helps to create a common language and common understanding among people that are interested in Canadian climate policy. And we're also hoping it helps shift the conversation towards our longer-term climate targets so that we can hold the government to account on policies that will achieve those targets and get us to where we want to be at mid-century. So that's the reasoning for creating this type of model for Canada and how we think it can be useful. Now, moving on to a bit more in-depth explanation of how the model actually works. The challenge faced by policymakers when trying to decide how to address climate and energy challenges usually isn't a lack of possible policies, but instead they're faced with a large number of policies that might or might not be effective. What the EPS does is it provides an objective means of sorting through all of the many policy options to understand which ones should be prioritized and combined in order to achieve a desired result, such as reduced emissions. Another key challenge in choosing policies to reduce pollutants is the fact that policies interact. So the way a policy behaves on its own will often be different than the way it behaves as part of an integrated package. A good way to address this challenge is by using a system dynamics computer model like the EPS, which treats the economy and its energy flows as an open, changing, and non-equilibrium system. With this design, the simulator is able to calculate the cumulative effects of a whole package of policies that interact in complex and nonlinear ways. An important benefit of the EPS is that it the trans
Apologies, folks. It seems we may have temporarily lost Brianne. Please bear with us. We'll just get back to you in a moment.
sector is land use and forestry, which includes both anthropogenic emissions and sequestration. And then the first major output that comes from all of these sectors is pollutants, and the model tracks 12 different pollutants. And the other main output is an estimation of direct cash flow changes, which is tracked separately for government, industry, and for consumers. So this is a basic overview of how the model works. There's also in-depth documentation online explaining the structure in much more detail that you can check out if you're interested. Moving on now to scenarios. So far, we have included 3 policy scenarios with the EPS. The first is business as usual, which is based on all publicly available data as of early 2016, since that's the latest data that excludes the effects of pan-Canadian framework policies. This scenario represents our projected trajectory of emissions with no additional climate or energy policies in place. So as you can see on the slide right now, the trajectory is starting at 841 megatons in 2017 and gently increasing out to 2050. One thing to note here is that our BAU is significantly higher than the government's reported reference case, which you can see roughly overlaid here in the orange line. This is because RBAU includes some emissions that aren't included in the national inventory, an important one being more up-to-date methane leakage rates, as well as emissions from international bunker fuels, transportation biomass, and land use. And our model also uses some different methodology. An example is that we use the most up-to-date global warming potentials from the 5th IPCC assessment report, while the government modeling uses the 4th assessment report. So that explains why RBAU is higher than you might be used to seeing. The second policy package included in the EPS is this Pan-Canadian Framework Policy, which is the blue line here. It represents the emissions trajectory to be expected with implementation of all policies included in the TCF, assuming no improvement beyond what has already been announced. So this assumes, for example, that the federal carbon price is increased to $50 per ton in 2022. And then stays constant from there all the way out to 2050 in emissions from PCF policies.
Bree, can I ask you to just go back a little bit? We missed that last explanation there.
Per year up to $130 per ton in 2030, and then to $330 per ton in 2050. What this package is demonstrating is that the PCF is on the right track towards our climate targets, but continual increase in the stringency of PCF policies is necessary in order for us to meet our 2030 emissions target. Those are the three policy scenarios we've developed for now. We plan to develop more policy packages as new legislation is announced and as we use the tool to explore what combinations we think are optimal for reaching our climate targets. And the best part is that anyone can create their own policy packages just like these ones. So I'll pass it over to Ben now to demonstrate how you can use the model.
Awesome. Thank you very much, Bree. So I'm waiting for Stephen to pass me this. Okay, all right. Okay, you should now be able to see my computer. Perfect. All right, so my name is Ben Israel, and I am an analyst with the Pembina Institute based out of Calgary, and I'm going to show you some of the core capabilities of the tool. So as you may already know, sorry, I'm not really sure you're seeing my screen right now. All right. As you may already know, the Energy Policy Simulator comes in two versions. Both versions are free and available to anyone. You have first a desktop version that you can download and then allows you to explore and change the input data, and also a web interface. So today, we are going to only look at the web-based version, which is located at policysolutions.pembina.org. It's important to note that this is a very simplified version of the model. However, this is the exact same version, this exact same model under the hood, and you'll get the exact same results as if you would be running the model locally. So I'm going to hit the Enter Simulator button here, and on the right, you can see a graph of carbon dioxide equivalent total emissions from Canada from now until 2050. And there are two targets on the graph for context. One is the NDC target for 2030, and the other one is a deep decarbonization target for 2050. Which represents 80 to 90% emission reduction compared to 2005 levels. And this is why the target right here actually has a vertical range. So there are actually two scenarios being displayed here. We have a business as usual scenario, or BAU, and something that is called the new scenario, which is right here in green. So the new scenario is right on top of the BAU because we have not added any policy to our new scenario yet. So on the left, we have our policy tools for scenarios. Those are divided by sectors. For example, transportation, building and appliances, electricity, industry, etc. And of course, we have a menu for cross-sector policies right here. So we have things like carbon capture and storage, fuel taxes, and of course, carbon tax. So if we take the example of the carbon tax, you can expand further the menu and set up a specific carbon tax rate for each of the sector. So you click on it and you have a pane that appears with a slider. In this case, let's decide that we want to apply a $100 ton per tax carbon tax on the industry. The model will think for a moment and update the curve right on the right. And this is actually the model running on the server. It takes less than a second to run the model on the server and update the scenario in the browser. There is something here that should be said about the implementation schedule. Right now, the carbon tax on the industry is being phased in linearly from 2018 to 2050. That means it currently only reaches $100 per ton of CO2 in 2050. That is something you can actually override, and so that you can implement policies in steps to better represent the reality of policies. So for example, if we take the example of the Pan-Canadian framework, the PCF currently proposes to reach $50 per ton in 2022. So let's assume a carbon tax that reaches $50 in 2022, then plateaus until 2030, then it starts increasing again and reach $100 per ton in 2030. So this is something you can program through the implementation schedule menu located right here. So let's say in 2022, we wanted to reach 50% of $100 per ton. Let's add it. And let's say that we wanted to plateau until 2030. So 50% again. Let's add it here. So you have here a very nice graph at the top that shows you the profile of the implementation schedule for this policy. So as you can see, carbon tax is 0 in 2017, increases to $50 in 2022, then plateaus till 2030, and before increasing again in a linear fashion until 2050. So if you click OK, the model will think for a moment and then update the graph on the right. Let's add another policy to our scenario. Let's say that we want all passengers for light-duty vehicles and freight heavy-duty vehicles to be electric by 2050. So we click on transportation, then electric vehicle sales mandate, and then we're gonna pick the right submenus. So that's passenger LDV. We put the slider to 100%. Click OK, and then we go to freight HGVs and do the same thing. You can see that the model thinks for a moment and then update the graph. And you can also see that we have now stabilized our emission trajectory with just a couple of policies. Let's pause the tool for a moment now and let's explore the options of the web interface. There is something that I should mention now is you can create an account in just a couple of clicks by clicking on that button here. And having an account actually allows you to save your scenarios. The button just on the left gives you access to an extensive documentation for the model. This is also where you can find links to download the model if you want to run it locally on your machine. Starting on the left, you can save a scenario using this button here. So let's click on it. Let's call this scenario meeting Paris, even though we are not meeting the Paris Agreement right now. And you can see that in the policy scenario selector here, you now have the name of this scenario. The next buttons right here allows you to save the scenario with a new name, rename the scenario, delete this scenario, etc. Like all the usual options that you can find in this type of interface. Another pretty cool option is the possibility to share the scenario and email it to someone. So for example, if you click here, you can input the email address of, let's say, your MP, add some comments and say, look at the crazy scenario for low carbon Canada that I just put together. Last thing I wanted to show you is in the menu, how you can decide the scenarios that you want to overlay on the same graph. So you can do that by clicking here. So you have scenarios that you create that are listed under like my scenario right here. And you have also scenarios that are already included in the tools, such as the business as usual scenario, the Pan-Canadian framework policy package, so this scenario, and the other Pan-Canadian framework extended to mid-century policies that Brie was describing earlier. Let's go back to the core capabilities of the model. If you look at this section here, this menu is called the output graph selector. You have a drop-down menu located here. And by clicking this drop-down menu located right here, you can select different ways to visualize your scenario. This is what I'm going to show you now, but there is one very quick technical note here. Like for those in the webinar, you cannot see the drop-down menu whenever I'm clicking on it. Like you cannot see all the options popping up when I'm clicking on it. It's just kind of a technical glitch of the webinar. So I just want you to understand that I'm referring to that menu right here. So let's switch views. Let's start by dividing up emission savings by sector. So this is done by clicking here. So note that we are still displaying the results for our meeting Paris scenario. At the top, you have the emission from the industry. You can actually note here the impact of the carbon tax ramping up, especially between now and 2022. Then you can see the emissions of transportation in this dark red. You can see this very nice band due to the impact of the EV adoption, electrical vehicles adoption. In yellow, you have the emissions from the electricity sector. Then you have the buildings in blue. And last, you have the emissions from land use in green. You can note that those emissions are negative because we're actually capturing under this scenario a bit more emissions than releasing in this sector. Let's maybe switch the scenario to something a bit more complex. Let's pick the Pan-Canadian framework scenario, which is included in the EPS tool. So you do that by switching to a different scenario in this policy scenario selector. And let's investigate the impact of this policy package on the electricity sector. So I'm gonna open this output graph selector menu and pick electricity capacity by type. There you go. So you can see all the capacity for electricity generation by type. You can see, for example, that coal is being phased out by 2030. This is a light gray area at the bottom here. Right on top of coal, you have a very thin black line. Those are actually the coal units being converted to natural gas. Right on top in red and pink, you have the gas-fired units, non-peakers and peakers. In green, you can see the nuclear power plant fleet. You can see there is a bit of decommissioning happening around the 2020s. And then in dark blue, you have the hydropower. And right at the top of the chart, you can note the pickup in renewables. So wind is light blue. You have solar in yellow and orange, and then biomass right here, and then geothermal. Let's switch, for example, to another view. You can also use the model to look at some financial metrics. So let's look at direct cash flow change by actor. So for example, this view indicates the first order cash flow, basically who's paying who across actors in the current scenario. So in the pan-Canadian framework scenario, you can see that the government, for example, is making a lot of money in the first years, right here, while the oil and gas industry at the bottom, in dark red, for example, go under like increased expenses. So this illustrates, for example, the impact of the methane regulation that they need to, this is basically new equipment that they need to buy, but also the kick-in of the carbon tax. And there is something that should be said here, actually, is that those are really like first order cash flow, and that the model does not account at all, not in this view at least, in the revenue recycling that is happening in the economy. Think, for example, of the way that the carbon tax has been designed in Alberta. Another really interesting chart that I want to show you is a wedge diagram. So that one, you need to select effects by policy and CO2 wedge diagram. So the chart is updating on the right. So this is a really interesting type of diagram because a wedge diagram allows for testing the contribution of each of the policy to the overall package. So you actually have two lines here. And the top black line is a business as usual scenario. And the bottom line is a scenario that we design, or as it's a pan-Canadian framework in that case. And all the wedges in the middle actually show the contribution of each of the policy to the emission saving. So in the case of the pan-Canadian framework, one can easily see that the carbon tax, which is right here in purple, is one main contributor to emission savings. You also have the methane emission reduction that you can visualize here in blue, which is another kind of pretty large contribution. And maybe one last that we could mention is building energy efficiency standard right here in light blue. One last way to visualize your scenario that I really would like to show to you, and also because I don't want to show you too many because I don't want to overwhelm you, is the effects by policy and that will show the CO2 abatement cost curve. So basically a marginal abatement or MAC curve. In this chart, each policy is represented by a box with the width of the box showing the emissions being reduced. So this is what you have here on the x-axis. And the height of the box is the cost of this policy per reduced ton of emissions. So you can actually see that many of those policies in the pan-Canadian framework, for example, have a negative cost. For example, this building energy efficiency standards. And that means that those policies will actually pay for themselves and save money on the long run. So that's about it. This is what I wanted to show you. There are many more graph types that are quite interesting to explore, but I just wanted to give you this very quick tour on the main tools capabilities.
Thanks very much, Ben. I believe that's the end of your presentation there. I think that we're going to try and give folks another chance to understand the assumptions underlying our PCF modeling, because we were hearing that it was really difficult for folks to get the audio feed on that, and so we do apologize. I think Bree is going to go back over a little bit of her presentation that folks may have missed before we proceed to the Q&A. So thank you again, and we do again apologize for the technical difficulties here. I'll just hand it over.
Sorry. Thanks, Bora. I just called in on my phone, so hopefully this is better, but just let me know if there's any issues.
We hear you loud and clear.
Perfect. So just to go over the policy scenarios again, because I think that's the main part that cut out for everyone. So far, we've included 3 policy scenarios with the EPS. The first is business as usual, which is based on all publicly available data as of early 2016, since that's the latest data that excludes the effects of pan-Canadian framework policies. So this scenario represents our projected trajectory of emissions with no additional climate or energy policies in place. As you can see on the slide right now, the trajectory is starting at 841 megatons in 2017 and then gently increasing out to 2050. One key thing to note here is that our BAU is significantly higher than the government's reported reference case, which you can see is overlaid in orange on the graph. This is because our BAU includes some emissions that aren't included in the national inventory, an important one being up-to-date methane leakage rates, as well as emissions from international bunker fuels, transportation biomass, and land use. And our model also uses some different methodology. One example is that we use the most up-to-date global warming potentials from the 5th IPCC assessment report, while the government uses the 4th assessment report. The second policy package included with the EPS is the Pan-Canadian Framework Package, which is the blue line on the graph here. It represents the emissions trajectory to be expected with implementation of all policies included in the PCF, assuming no improvement beyond what has already been announced. So this assumes, for example, that the federal carbon price is increased to $50 per ton in 2022 and then stays constant from there all the way out to 2050. As you can see on the slide, the EPS predicts that the PCF policy scenario could be really effective in reducing emissions. It suggests the policies currently on the books could lead to a 255 megaton reduction in CO2e emissions in 2030. So for comparison, the government's original PCF document predicts a 175 megaton reduction in emissions from PCF policies. The third policy package included in the EPS is called PCF extended to mid-century, and it's represented here by the red line. This policy package increases the ambition of the PCF by assuming that policies continue to be strengthened past their announced end dates at a constant rate through 2050, or until their full potential is realized if that happens before 2050. So the carbon tax is a good example. It continues to increase by $10 per year up to $130 per ton in 2030, and then to $330 per ton in 2050. What this package demonstrates is that the PCF is on the right track towards our climate targets, but continual increase in the stringency of PCF policies is necessary in order for us to get to our 2030 emissions target. So hopefully that clarifies things for people, because that was cut out. Another thing I mentioned is that these are the 3 packages we've designed for now. But we also plan to develop more packages as new legislation is announced and as we use this tool to explore what combinations we think are optimal for reaching our climate targets. So I think now I'll pass it back to Bora and we can move into the Q&A.
Excellent. Thank you very much, Bree. And again, folks, sorry for the jumbled order of the agenda there, but hopefully that was able to clarify some of your questions earlier in the presentation. We'll turn now to the Q&A, and I see that a number of questions have been submitted. I think I can probably just jump into it myself, one question asked about whether the model can be adapted by users or sponsors to provincial jurisdictions where most policy is set. That's from Peter. So Peter, the answer to that question is absolutely yes, and this is something that Pembina has started to explore just in a very preliminary way. Of course, the difficulty with scaling the model down to the provincial level is that in Canada, there is a lack of data, essentially, and some question over the availability of data and the availability of data that would be granular enough for us to get at province level emissions and all the various other outputs that the model delivers, as Ben was showing. But it is something that we've raised with Environment and Climate Change Canada, and that we're certainly interested in doing. The other point to make around this is that users anywhere can adapt the model to suit their own needs. So if you are aware of data sets that you feel would be better sources of information for some of the policy levers in the model, or that would better represent a certain province, you can download the full version of the model online and go into the data files and submit them yourself and create your own version. So absolutely, it's a great question. Most policy is set at the provincial level, especially when it comes to energy. So it's an area of future work for sure. So another question here from Matthew, why does the online simulator not function for me? We're really sorry to hear that, Matthew. I suggest you email the policysolutions@pembina.org email address, and hopefully we can take that conversation offline here and help you to access the model so that you can use it. But it should be available online for all to use. It was previously protected by a password, but we've lifted that now. It's also possible that you're using a web browser that is perhaps not up to date. So a quick check on the version of your web browser would be a useful thing to do in order to get that functionality online.
Okay, I'm seeing a question about emissions from forest fires, so I can jump in and answer that. This model includes land use, unlike the government models, that because of reporting requirements, the government chooses not to include any land use, because then that would require them to include non-anthropogenic land use emissions, such as forest fires. For us, the way that the model is structured is it does include anthropogenic emissions and sequestration from land use, including forests, but it doesn't include non-anthropogenic emissions, such as forest fires or permafrost or pine beetle or other insects. So that's, you're right in the question, that's a huge source of emissions that is not accounted for in this model or in the government's model.
And it's a great point, Bree, that I believe the decision, the UNFCCC, the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change, in the guidelines that the IPCC, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, has issued for countries developing their national inventories, it leaves it to the discretion of countries to choose whether or not to include those sorts of emissions in the inventory. And Canada has opted in all of its reporting so far not to include those fluxes. And that's something that we have opted to follow for now, but it is certainly an important point when we're talking about the actual overall effect on the climate. I think we'll turn to Jeffrey now for a question on electric aircraft. I'll read that out. Could you read that out for us?
Absolutely. So the question is, a quick question on air transportation. Is there any functionality to build a scenario for electric flights and the impact of emissions? So this is a good example where the web tool and the downloadable version diverge a bit. The web tool is designed to only show the most common sorts of policy levers and policy options, whereas the downloadable version lets you do more or less anything. So the model does support electrifying any vehicle type, whether or not that's technically feasible today using current technologies. That would include aircraft. We don't have that aircraft electrification policy levers exposed in the web interface because those policies aren't rising to the level of importance that we want to highlight in the web interface. But you can simply download the tool and apply electrification to aircraft in the downloadable version only. I also see a question here on embodied emissions versus energy emissions. I'll take that one too. So the question is, do you plan to include policy options or scenarios to reduce embodied emissions, or are you only focused on policies on energy? I'll speak about the tool more than about any given policy package here. So the tool includes emissions, energy-related emissions, and land use-related emissions, and what we call process emissions. Process emissions are the non-energy emissions from the industry sector. They're things like the F-gases, high global warming potential fluorinated gases that are manufactured for use as refrigerants or propellants and that leak eventually into the atmosphere. Those, for example, F-gases that are produced in the course of building refrigerators and eventually reach the atmosphere might be considered embodied emissions of a sort. We do have policies in the simulator that reduce process emissions. Some of them, like the methane leakage ones, are actually used in the policy packages like TCF and PCF Extended. Still more are available in the web interface and in the downloadable version.
Thanks very much,
see a question. Oh, sorry, go ahead.
No, please go ahead, Bree. What was the question you'd like to take?
Yeah, I see questions about increasing the carbon price. There's a couple of them. So one is it possible for users to adjust the base carbon price to higher and more rapid increasing alternatives, say beginning at $30, increasing rapidly to $300 for the industry sector? Yes, so the implementation schedule feature that Ben showed in his demo is what allows you to do that. So you can go in and you can put in whatever carbon price number you want, and whenever year you want it to reach that. You could do really funky things where it goes up and then it goes back down and then it goes up again. You really have a lot of freedom there to do what you want, and you can also do the price by sector as you're suggesting. So you could make it higher for the industry sector or the transportation sector and just play around with it and see what the results are.
Quick addendum to that, Bree, just to say that the slider in the web application does max out at about $350 a ton, whereas the downloadable version has no maximum for those of you who want to get really crazy with your carbon prices. So we're getting a few other questions here. I'm just collecting them. Thanks everyone for bearing with us.
Ben here. I see a question around the border carbon adjustment or OBA. Like, are the capabilities in the model to explore leakage prevention mechanisms such as border carbon adjustment or OBA? That's a great question.
An OBA, for folks who don't know, Ben, is output-based allocation.
Sorry for speaking jargon here. This is the type of policy that Alberta put in place to prevent carbon leakage, especially in the industry. And there will be kind of a similar policy implemented at the federal level as basically a backstop. So the model does look into the potential carbon leakage, although you need to download the other version of the model. Like, this is not something you can see in the web interface, but it does not really, this is not exactly an input into the model. And in this version of the model, we had to make somewhat of an assumption to actually model the effect of the output-based allocation currently proposed by the federal government at the Canadian level. And this is something we're gonna be looking into with more details when we start doing some provincial versions of the model.
Thanks, Ben. We're going to turn to Jeffrey again for a question around residential solar.
Hello. So the question I'm seeing here is, can I customize an analysis of CO2 reductions at a residential level from combining solar thermal, solar PV, and building efficiency? There are a variety of policies in the model that will allow you to affect residential energy use and therefore CO2, including these things you mentioned. So for solar PV, there are policies that can encourage. I mean, there is a business as usual level of deployment of rooftop solar, which is based on the input data sets that were discussed earlier. And then the policies that let you produce more rooftop solar above and beyond that business as usual include either a subsidy for rooftop solar systems or a sort of a tranche of a renewable portfolio standard requiring a certain amount of electricity to come from those systems. A couple of the policies that have been used worldwide to push additional rooftop solar. Solar thermal, I assume, is applying to hot water heaters, not electric power generation like a solar thermal power plant, because we're talking about residential buildings. Water heaters their demand for energy is factored in. They're considered a type of appliance in the model. The model breaks down buildings by building component. There are building heating systems, that refers to the air heating, building cooling systems, building envelope, building lighting, appliances, and other energy using components. You can reduce the use of energy from appliances, which would include water heaters, through policies like stronger energy efficient building codes. You'll be entering that as a percentage energy use reduction. You're not going to be entering it as a number of solar thermal water heaters or the like, but the model can get out what you're looking for there. Building efficiency is certainly there, and as I said, it's broken into components. So you can set standards separately on each of those components, improving the building insulation, improving its heating system, improving its lighting, and so forth. So you can see what types of building codes or what types of appliance standards would do the most to improve building efficiency. So there's a good number of options there, as well as some things we haven't talked about. For example, in commercial buildings, there's an accelerated retrofitting policy and so forth. There's another question here that I can address. It says, I'm just finding it here. Okay.
I can read it for you if you like. It's from Christoph. I noticed with one of the examples that electricity demand appeared to cap out at a certain level, maybe after 2030. does that model factor in growth in demand for services such as electricity out to 2050?
Great, good question. So the electricity demand is not entered into the model as just an amount of electricity demand that could get capped. It comes from the sectors that demand services. So the building sector will demand a certain amount of electricity based on the number of building components and whether they're natural gas using or electricity using components. And so industry similarly will demand some electricity, and transportation will demand an increasing amount as the vehicle fleet electrifies. And these things are summed up and accounting for transmission and distribution losses, and that determines how much electricity the electricity sector is going to try to generate. Whether or not the demand keeps growing or appears to cap out at a certain level does not depend on the electricity sector. It depends on the projected demand in the demand sectors. So, for example, a scenario with a lot more electric vehicles will be less likely to have the electric demand appear to cap out than one with fewer electric vehicles. So that's a matter controlled by the input data set, not so much by the model structure or policy levers. And that input data set is based on objective government sources, which seem to show the demand somewhat flattening and following the curve you can see in the model. So that's where that comes from.
Thanks very much, Jeff. A question for you, Bree, from Harshan. Who in your mind are likely users of this tool, and has there been any interest from public sector organizations or municipalities in the use of this?
Yeah, so one main group that we hope will use this tool is NGOs and other civil society groups. We hope that it can help them to engage more constructively with governments on these topics by coming to the table with numbers on hand. We can also see academics using the tool and are really interested to see in different policy combinations that different people can come up with. And as for public entities, we briefed the federal government on this tool prior to our launch, and we did have a really positive response from some ministries that showed interest in using it in their work. It would be great if they did, and we do think it would be useful, for example, for the environment and climate change. In terms of provincial governments and municipalities, it's a national tool right now, so it doesn't really have the granularity to be useful for them yet. But as Ben was mentioning, it is in our scope to start developing provincial models, starting with Alberta. So that would be something that could be useful for the Alberta government. And just a final note is that other versions of this tool that have been developed for other countries have been used by governments. Specifically, the Chinese government used their version of the EPS to help build their most recent 5-year plan. So that's a demonstration of how it can be useful for them.
Great, thanks, Bree. Looking at the time here, want to be respectful of everyone's busy days. So again, thank you so much for joining us, and we really encourage you to follow up if you have any further questions. We weren't able to get through all of the questions that people submitted here, but there was a kind of logistical question about how to actually download the full version of the model. So briefly, I can say that what you need to do is download the Vensim model reader, which is freely available, and then download the Canada version of the model. There are directions online, and essentially there's a small link that looks like an eye above the web version of the model that will walk you through how to do this. And if you do have any problems, please feel free to reach out via the email address that was just on the screen a moment ago. As well, I'd just like to say there is an FAQ that we've developed and which is being updated regularly as more questions come in. So you can also give that a quick look if you think you might be able to find some answers there. So thanks again, everyone, for joining us today. We hope this has been informative, and we look forward to continuing the conversation on climate and energy policy in Canada with you all. Thanks very much.